Okay, looks like we are live here on Standing for Truth. So I want to welcome everybody today to the show. On Standing for Truth, we focus on the truth of biblical creation. And I am very excited about today's show. We have Sal Giardina back with us, and this will be Sal's fourth appearance on Standing for Truth. Now, I have linked his previous presentations as well as audience Q&As in the description box. So please check that out. His previous shows, especially for any new subscribers to Standing for Truth. The first one with Sal was Erosion, Amazing Evidence for Young Earth Creation. His second presentation was Physical Geology of Planet Earth versus Evolution's Deep Time. His third was Evolution's Deep Time. And today we are going to be discussing Evolution's Deep Time is non-reality. So please make sure you are tagging me with your questions at Standing for Truth. This is going to be a fantastic presentation. So let me bring in Sal as well as George. George and Sal, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
No problem.
Thank you, Donnie and George, for having me on the program, Standing for Truth.
My pleasure. Sal, thank you so much for giving us your time. I know you're busy, and we very much appreciate the time you give us. As I always say, you've been a blessing to this ministry. So, Sal, maybe if you wanted to give a brief introduction for anybody who might not yet be aware of who you are. We've got some new subscribers, and then I think we'll just kind of get right into the presentation.
Okay. Greetings this evening to everyone watching. Just very brief background. I am a graduate mechanical engineer with a degree in mechanical engineering. I have a master's degree in geology, and I've also have been a Air Force pilot and a commercial airline pilot instructor, instructing many flight crews in flying the Boeing 737 and Boeing 757. And I'm glad to be here tonight with you.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Sal. Again, looks like we've got questions coming in, so I'm going to make sure I'm saving those guys. After the presentation, we will have an audience Q&A. George, any introductory words from you, brother?
Yeah, I'd like to thank Sal again for coming on, and I just want to concur what Nicholas is saying in the chat. He says he prefers the lectures over the debates, and he finds the lectures are incredibly informative. I totally agree with him. So without taking too much time, over to you.
Amen. Well said, George. Sal, let me put your slides up on screen here. And the floor is yours, Sal, whenever you're ready.
Okay, I have a lot to cover with, ladies and gentlemen, tonight. So without ado, I'm going to jump right into this. You know, the world at large has done a great job at basically convincing people of evolutionary deep time. That is, that the Earth and the cosmos itself has been hanging around for countless billions of years. And specifically, the Earth, it is alleged, is 4.5 billion years old. This is a difficult topic to get across to people because it simply, I believe, is an illusion. And over the last number of sessions that I've had with you, I believe I've been presenting to you circumstantial evidence, which is compelling. The amount of evidence from both paleontology and structural geology, that is the rocks themselves, provide a data set of circumstantial evidence, which is compelling, because circumstantial evidence, once you have a sufficient amount of it, basically eliminates all alternative conjectures. And it is used in a court of law as actually having greater strength many times than direct evidence of direct witnesses, etc. And so tonight, we're going to continue with a cold case on the age of the Earth. There is no direct evidence that I will give you tonight, but I am going to give you a data set which you as the judge and the jury out there can decide for yourself, because every one of you listening to this has a unique intelligence and capability of weighing information and evidence for yourself and coming to a reasonable conclusion. We have two suspects, you might say, regarding the age of the Earth. Number one, it is contended that the Earth stands accused of being 4.5 billion years old. However, Scripture contends the Earth is about 6,000 years old. In some people's minds, either A or B could be remotely possible. In fact, as I mentioned, many people are under the illusion that it is, in fact, 4.5 billion years old, because this is all they have been indoctrinated with since perhaps they were very young. Can both A or B be correct? Absolutely not. By the logical law of mutual exclusion, only one of these can be correct. One is correct, the other is wrong. And it's up to you, the audience, to weigh the information which is presented tonight and by other creationists to make a decision for yourself. You are the judge and jury. You must decide which is reasonable between A and B. Now, initially, the first part of the illusion, as I mentioned last week, is that when you look at the chronographic chart of the geologic column, the sedimentary rocks shown by three columns, which should be really stacked one on top of the other, this being the lower one, the middle one, and the upper section of the sedimentary rocks, which are claimed to have accumulated over 540 million years. This geologic column is then shown against the Precambrian rock, which is all the rock of the Earth's crust, below the Cambrian sedimentary rocks. That's therefore it's called Precambrian. But the first visual illusion is that this column is not shown in the proper proportion, because according to evolutionary theory itself, the Precambrian rocks of the Earth, which are distinct, of course, from the water-lane sedimentary rocks, represent 88% of all evolutionary time. And so it really should be expanded in the proper proportion to give the proper perspective of time. This section here should be 5 times longer than these three sections placed end to end. The problem is, it's not common knowledge that 88% of all proposed Earth history displays none, zero evolutionary biologic progression. And thus, it is not reasonable to conclude that biologic evolution has been progressing throughout basically Earth's history. It's simply an illusion. The idea of 3 billion years of non-evolution progression, as shown by the microorganisms contained in the Precambrian rock, which we talked about last month, this idea is equivalent to rationalizing jamming a square block into a round hole. It just simply doesn't fit. You cannot call evolution a progressive theory when in fact there is no progression for over 3 billion years whatsoever. So again, I we want to concentrate on the 1/2 billion years of the Phanerozoic column from these sedimentary rocks which have accumulated on what is called the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic era. And they're really a worldwide evidence of catastrophic sedimentation. The last several sessions I showed unquestionably that as you go down the entire 500 million years of this sedimentary column, the actual field evidence from paleontology and the structural geology of the sedimentary layers themselves show that all of this has been accumulated very rapidly. Everywhere we look worldwide, we find evidence of rapid sedimentation, which is totally in contrary to the idea that these units can be dated as having, accumulated slowly over hundreds of millions of years. Proverbs 18:17 says every story sounds good until you hear the other side of the story. So in the last few sessions, we showed that the existence of fossils, their preservation says no to the idea of deep time. We showed that sand pipes and dikes, these seismic structures, which penetrate hundreds and hundreds of feet of the sedimentary layers, also say no to deep time accumulation of these sediments. And tonight we're going to look at something that you probably are not too familiar with. So I'm going to take the time to talk about unconformities and in particular paraconformities. Perhaps at a future session we could look at the soft organic tissue which is being discovered all throughout the geologic column. Where is the justification, ladies and gentlemen, for deep time? Is there physical evidence to support deep time? If this were a jury trial, you're going to have to present your evidence to support your contention. Unconformities, let's take a look at it. An unconformity is a proposed gap in time between geologic units. Well, what does that mean? A proposed elapsed time interval between the contact of distinct geological strata. I've illustrated that here for you as that here we have a section of various geologic strata which has been dated. A certain section in here has given an evolutionary time span, let's say, of so many millions of years based on the fossil content, you see. We covered this in previous sessions. All this dating comes down after all the smoke clears, and it comes down to basically the dates are based on the assumption of the evolution of various organisms over time and each of these so-called biostratigraphic units. Now, when we move to a different location on the Earth, we sometimes find the same fossils here below this contact and the same fossils here that are dated under the assumption of evolutionary progression. And missing in between them is this section, okay? This missing section, the contact would be called an unconformity because it is believed that a certain amount of time has passed by without any deposition or perhaps the erosion of these sediments have taken place. They're no longer visible. And the idea that this period of time has passed is simply based on what they believe is the age of the fossils below and above the unconformity, because it is contended that it is missing these strata here. The overlying units are believed to be much younger than the underlying units. So let me give you just a little better explanation here. Okay, the overlying units over the contact, this would be the contact here. As shown by this moving arrow. These overlying units are contended to be much younger than the units below. And based on the field evidence, it would be called a disconformity, an angular unconformity, or a nonconformity. Disconformity where we have parallel sedimentary rocks above and below with a very distinct and obvious erosion surface, which would basically, if such a distinct erosion surface existed in the field, would basically point to the fact that there has been a vast period of time between these layers. That is a big if. We have angular unconformities where obviously these rocks have been tilted and planed off by at some time during an erosion process, and then parallel strata at a later time placed on top. But again, we have to ask ourselves, what is the evidence of the passage of millions of years between the age of these strata, even though we see a basically erosion surface here. And then we have a nonconformity in which we have sedimentary rocks over igneous and metamorphic rocks, obviously distinction. And if we could show a very distinct and vast amount of erosion and evidence of the passage of time between them, then we might be able to justify saying that these rocks are much younger than them, and there is a missing amount of geologic strata between them, if you're following me here. The thing is, though, you have to see evidence for erosion, such as soil layers, chemical weathering of the surface, and actual physical erosion in terms of relief on the surface, topographic relief. If the suspension were for, say, millions of years, that is, it's considered that a passage of time between these contacts was millions of years, a corresponding surface of erosion would be expected along with the processes acting on the surface for these countless millions of years. So let's use some logic here. I'm going to ask you to just follow me with some logic. I'm going to ask someone some questions that is totally impartial and to this discussion, and is not, well, this person uses their reasoning without emotion, any emotion, and is totally logical and impartial, okay? So I'm going to ask this person a few questions. Can a time interval really be missing? If you believe that that's true, then we ask Dr. Spock what he has to say. Totally illogical, sir. Where would it go? It is obvious that an unconformity cannot represent missing time. Time waits for no one, as you know. It passes at the same rate unless you're going at close to the speed of light, and we're here on the surface of the earth. We're not doing that. Okay, so time passes at the same rate. The time, an unconformity does not mean that there's missing time at the contact between the upper and lower units. That would be totally illogical. Okay, then if the answer to that question is no, it is not missing time, then what we have here is you have to assume, the evolutionary community would have to assume that nothing happened for millions of years during this so-called passage of time. However, Let's think about this. It's completely improbable. Why? Because there is no place, ladies and gentlemen, on the surface of the earth, and this is not arm waving or, I'm being impractical. There is no place on the surface of the earth where there is nothing happening for millions of years. The surface of the earth, everywhere we go, is active. It is either in a process of deposition, sediments are being deposited, and if they're not being deposited at a location, the surface is being eroded, right? We can't get around the second law of thermodynamics, okay? Everything tends to deteriorate over a period of time, just like a roadway. If you just left it to itself, it eventually would deteriorate just sitting out there in time. So obviously the time interval can't be missing. Then logically millions of years of natural processes must be expected during this alleged period of millions of years between these rock layers at the unconformity, right? We have to then logically expect natural processes to be expected. There is not a cessation anywhere on Earth of natural processes. Okay, just ask any evolutionist, show me the evidence. Show me the evidence at the contact. There's no evidence of deep time at the contact. We will show you there's no evidence of natural processes undergoing at the contact between these units for millions of years. And if there's no evidence, then the deep time simply is an illusion. This is just a simple mental exercise which follows reasonable logic. Let's just take a look, ladies and gentlemen, a little bit more of what we're speaking of. Here we have the different types of unconformities. We have an angular unconformity with an obvious erosion surface that planed off these units. We have a disconformity, which in reality, if there is actually does represent millions of years of passage of time, then the erosion surface on the surface of the earth would have to be very significant. Obviously, there's no place on the earth that could undergo erosion for millions of years without having deep gullies, canyons, soil developed, and chemical erosion at the surface. Then we have these nonconformities. Similarly, we must find evidence for the passage of time. However, many of the unconformities are labeled as paraconformities, in which there is no evidence of any erosion whatsoever. We have parallel sedimentary rocks laying directly on top of other parallel sedimentary rocks. There is not even any evidence whatsoever of an erosion surface like you would see here. And many of these unconformities are called paraconformities with no evidence whatsoever, as shown here in this case, where we have the limestone of one age, the coconino sandstone overlying the Hermit Shale with a knife edge contact which extends for hundreds and hundreds of miles with no evidence whatsoever of erosion or the passage of time. So one would have to conclude there was a cessation of natural processes for all that time, which is basically impossible on this earth. Gordon E. Davidson, in a textbook on sequences of flood stratigraphy, says this: the essential feature of an unconformity is a structural discordance, which is represented by an erosional surface. Thus, a paraconformity is not an unconformity because, as I've just shown, there is no evidence of a erosional surface whatsoever. Dr. Morris has shown this diagram so that you can kind of see what's happening here. I'm going to take you kind of backstage to show you why there are so many unconformities designated by evolutionary geologists in the geologic column. This is a diagram in the Grand Canyon, just as an example, but similar unconformities are assured us, supposedly, all over the earth. And these spaces represent the passage of time between the so-called known ages of these rock units, and the passage of time is represented here. Let me just show you one right here. We're going to look at in detail. The lower layer is dated in the 530 million years ago, and the upper layer, see, that's the lower layer, the upper layer right here with a little bit of other strata in it is at 370 million years. Okay, so we have about a passage of 160 million years of time, supposedly, between these layers. Okay, now the reason for I will show you is that this evolutionary geologists will get very disturbed if you try to show them that there is no evidence for this passage of all these time intervals, is because, ladies and gentlemen, this is where they're hiding a good deal of the so-called deep time, because many of them acknowledge the fact that all these strata worldwide, as we've shown in previous examples to you, have been deposited rapidly over time. Everywhere we look, we have a ubiquitous, universal evidence that the sedimentary rocks have been deposited rapidly. And if that being so, where are they going to come up with the 540 million years of Earth history? Well, much of it is concealed, you might say, or imagined to exist in these unconformities. Passage of time between the layers. And so it's a place to, with a sleight of hand and a quick of hand, like an illusionist, to convince you that there is a passage of hundreds of millions of years with a sleight of hand without any real evidence to show this. A paraconformity is a hypothetical surface, hypothetical, not a good thing to present to a court of law, to a jury. A hypothetical surface between conformable layers believed to have been separated by a long period of what? Non-deposition and non-erosion. Why? Because there's no evidence of deposition or erosion in a paraconformity. Now, let me explain something to you, ladies and gentlemen. There is no place on the earth, in this physical world, where there is both non-deposition and non-erosion. Every place on the earth, and I'm repeating myself, but this is obvious from the second law of thermodynamics, that if there is no deposition going on of sediments between these layers, in other words, it's claimed that they're missing, certain fossiliferous layers are missing because they weren't deposited. Okay, if you want to go with that, then there has to be erosion. You can't have both non-deposition and non-erosion for millions of years at any place on the surface of the earth. The earth is active at all times. Let's take a look at some of these in the Grand Canyon. Right here, between the Coconino Sandstone and the Hermit Shale, is considered a paraconformity. Why? Because as I showed you before, there's basically a knife edge planar surface between the two, with no evidence of soil formation, chemical erosion at the surface, or any topographic relief, which we would expect if, in fact, that surface is represented as claimed in the textbooks as represented 10 million years of cessation of physical processes. You think? There is no place on earth where there is a cessation of both non-deposition and non-erosion, yielding no evidence whatsoever. Totally improbable and basically impossible. Let's take a look at the stratigraphic hiatus in southeastern Utah. This is a representation of the geologic column, and the brown areas are sedimentary rocks and formations that are well known. They extend for thousands of square miles in the southwest, not just in this area of Utah, on the Colorado Plateau. And these striped areas, ladies and gentlemen, are the so-called missing time between these layers. Okay? This gives you a visual. Evolutionary reasoning requires these gaps because of the assumed biostratigraphic ages of the strata. Okay? The assumed time gaps are based on the assumed age of these strata based on the fossil content of the units, the upper and lower units. They're actually resting on each other, but you could see that there's actually more missing time, so to speak, or passage of so-called passage of time than it is that it would take for the deposition of these rocks. Herein is where much of the geologic column, the deep time, is hidden. A true discontinuity of layers on either side of a large time gap, which are nearly horizontal and exhibit field evidence of significant topographic relief or chemical weathering. So if this were, in fact, in the field, a true discontinuity, okay, then you would expect to have significant topographic relief. We're not just talking about a few feet or a few tens of feet. If this surface was exposed to erosion for millions of years and it extends over thousands of square miles, we would expect to see a relief comparable to what we see as we travel across the country today. There would be riverbeds, canyons, crevices, and other depositional environments, as I pointed out in a previous session. Right here, we're going to concentrate now. I'm going to take you behind the scenes and show you something which is, show you how the illusion is done. We are told that this discontinuity, this is a true discontinuity between the red wall limestone, the Mississippian limestone, and the Cambrian mauve formation in the Grand Canyon. This, we are told for certain, oh, it's for sure, that it represents, this contact represents a passage of time of 200 million years. That would require a cessation of physical processes of 200 million years along this entire planar surface, which extends for tens of thousands of miles. Now, as you walk down the north rim of the Grand Canyon on the trail, you will pass this contact. And you will see a sign at a certain point as you walk on down. which basically this is what the sign says. This is an unconformity. Rocks of Ordovician and Silurian periods are missing. Okay, that's about 160 million years of geologic time. They're missing. The Tempe Butte limestone of Devonian age occurs in scattered pockets, i.e. relief of maybe 10 feet, perhaps 20 feet, which is very small amount of relief. The Redwall limestone rests on these Devonian rocks or on mauve limestone of much earlier Cambrian age. That's what this sign is trying to tell you. If it can be shown that there's no hiatus between the Redwall limestone and the underlying mauve limestone, then this conclusion would discredit geologic time as promoted by some geologists, for sure. And it would do great damage to the macroevolution model of origins. Okay, so what we're going to show you is how this 200 million years could actually, of alleged time, how it could actually disappear because it's really non-existent. Stand by. As you come down from the sign on the trail, as you're walking down the trail, and I believe the trail comes down right through here, hard to see on this photo, cuts across the contact right here, and there is the park service sign right here as you're coming on down from the Redwall limestone into the Cambrian mauve limestone. Okay, but here's the problem. As you come on down, you'll see that both units grade in and out of each other. There is not a distinct contact line in many places. You see these pockets right here are very unique thin pockets of a micaceous shale are found both in the Mississippian limestone and in the lower Cambrian rocks. And as you go on down, you're going in and out of both units into the lower Cambrian, out of the back into the Mississippian. The micaceous shale, these are layers that both occur in both the Redwall and the mauve limestones. They support the idea that these Mississippian and Cambrian deposits were formed almost simultaneously. There are also fossil wormholes in here called trace fossils. This is a pen to show you for scale of these very thin shaly units that occur in both the Mississippian and the Cambrian sediments. Now, we wouldn't expect to find such a thin, unique unit in both of these formations if they are, in fact, about 200 million years old, separated in time. Again, here's a closer look at it. The modeled limestone of this type was found in both the mauve and the Redwall-like deposits below the supposed contact surface. Its presence in patches within both types of strata is another evidence favoring simultaneous deposition. Dunbar and Rogers state this: if the beds above and below bear fossils by which they can be assigned their proper position. Whoa, what is meant by their proper position? That is the biostratigraphic age that is assumed by the fossil content, right? We talked about that previously. The assumption that strata can be dated by the proposed evolutionary sequence of the fossil progression. it can be assigned their proper position in the instances. This is the final and the only criterion. See, we're not talking about radioisotope dating. Remember, I says it always comes down to the assumed age of the fossil content based on evolutionary assumptions. And that is the only criterion that gives quantitative results for the large unconformities. For example, where red wall limestone can be dated as lower Mississippian and the underlying mauve limestone as middle Cambrian, we know, okay, this is Dunbar and Rogers, principles of stratigraphy. We know, wow, that the paraconformity represents more than 3 geologic periods. Many large unconformities would never be suspected if it were not for such dating of the rocks above and below. We know. Objection, Judge. This is not evidence. We know. You're begging the question, okay? What you are doing is basically assuming, when we say we know, you're begging the question. What you are doing is presenting as evidence what you are assuming to try to prove. This is a logical fallacy and is not accepted in a court. Okay, but we know that the paraconformity represents more than 3 geologic periods, right? Based on the assumption of the dated age of the rocks in the first place, not on any other particular evidence. Similarly, Noble in 1914 experienced great difficulty trying to determine just where the Cambrian strata stopped and the Mississippian began in Bass Canyon, a side canyon. I'm going to take you in there in a moment. Because fossil and rock data failed to suggest an unconformity. Oh, 200 million years of a passage of time, but the fossil and rock data failed to confirm this. Because of the lack of fossils and the failure to detect the line of erosion that would mark a division between the two units, it has been necessary to fix tentatively the base of the red wall by means of lithology rock type. In other words, they arbitrarily picked where they felt the red wall stopped and the underlying mauve limestone began. Okay. Now I'm going to take you backstage, folks. Hang in there with me. I'm going to show you how this illusion of 200 million years is done and how with a sweep of the magician's hand, you can be coaxed into believing that there's so much time between these two units. We're in the side canyon of the Grand Canyon. We have here massive red wall Mississippian limestone base dated in the area of 300 million years near the base, 320 million years, something in that nature. We have under here the mauve, the Cambrian mauve, dated at 520 million years. And look carefully, okay? We have the mauve, we have the Cambrian. Now, if you were walking up this slope or climbing, you went from here, you went back in time 200 million years. As you climb up, you went forward in time 200 million years. Now you're going forward in time. Back in time, right there, you're back into the Mississippian. Now you're going forward in time. I'm sorry, this would be back in time, forward in time. So you are alternating between 200 million years of interval. This is called a textbook case of what we call intercalated sediments, where sediments are found interfingered with each other, and in a textbook case that the only way that this is possible is by a continuous deposition of sediments from these sediments here back and forth up into this sediment, into the red wall. The only explanation for this type of interfiguring is a textbook classic case of continuous deposition without an interval. Otherwise, you would need a time machine to go to jump 200 million years back and forth as you're going across these layers. By the way, this slide is given by permission of Dr. Don Patton, a geologist who I am acquainted with. This basically is as close to direct evidence as you're going to find. It's circumstantial evidence, but it is as close to direct evidence as you're going to find. It basically proves the layers are contemporaneous. Looks continuous, and they are continuous. This is a devastating contact where you have these alternating layers like this. It cannot be millions of years apart. Let's take a look at the great unconformity. If 200 million years isn't enough, you are told that in the Grand Canyon, the unconformity between the Cambrian sediments and the basement rocks, the Precambrian rocks, is as much as, let's just use round numbers, about 1.5 billion years. There has been an elapsed time interval, depending on where you are along the contact. If you move along here, it could be, the contact could be as short as about 500 to 700 million years, okay? So it's an enormous amount of time has passed, is what you're told. And this is a place where much of the deep time of the geologic column is basically hidden in it with a wave of the hand. The presumed erosion is 100 times greater than that required for the entire relief in the Grand Canyon area. This time here, period, that is proposed of a 1.5 billion years, let me repeat myself, is 100 times greater than about the 5 million years contended by evolutionists to produce 5,000 feet of relief in the entire Grand Canyon. It's simply illogical. At the base, right here, of the great unconformity, this is your Precambrian rock, igneous and metamorphic rock. Without going into the detail of the formation, we have the Cambrian Tapeats sandstone. This sandstone has been studied extensively and found to have been laid down not slowly, but by extensive tests have been found to represent very high velocity waters have laid down the lowermost Cambrian sedimentary rocks. And that's attested to because within the Cambrian sediments are found boulders, huge boulders that are been ripped up during this erosion process, a rapid erosion, ripped up and incorporated into the base of the Tapeats sandstone. Again, giving a reason for this erosion surface, not a surface of 1.5 billion years, but a very high energy rapid erosion caused by the high energy velocity of waters. This is not just local. The Tapete sandstone is found throughout the country and even overseas. And eastern United States in the New England area, I remember I have mapped this and walked it out many years ago. It's called the Potsdam sandstone there. So this basically flat erosion surface, which is obviously formed by the high velocity sediment and deposition of the rocks above it, of the Cambrian, is found across much of the world. Here I am in the Payson, and if you were to put your hand right across this contact, you are being told that this contact represents 1 billion year gap in the Payson area between the Precambrian and the lowermost Cambrian sediments. So right in here with a sleight of hand is 1 billion years of so-called Earth history. But the question is, there is no evidence here for that passage of 1 billion years, especially when you see this erosion surface throughout the country is basically flat and without any relief, soil layers, significant soil layers, without any other areas of deposition, environmental areas of deposition or chemical weathering. Now I'm going to show you this picture here. I want you to pay attention. I'm presenting this as evidence in the court. With your own eyes, as you watch this, you are looking at a logical fallacy, a gross error in reasoning. I'm going to pause to let you look at this. Over here, you may not be able to read this and see it. This represents an unconformity. It's pointing to a flat layer between units of 10 million years. And this very fine line, flat surface, you are told represents a passage of 20 million years in the Grand Canyon. Okay? 10 million years, 20 million years along this surface, which can be traced for thousands of square miles. Now look at this image, and I want you to put on your thinking cap because you are looking with your own eyes at a logical fallacy. This is a gross error. Can you see the error in reasoning? It's right in front of your eyes. What would negate this idea? The arrows represent 10 and 20 million years of alleged erosional time gap along these surfaces, planar surfaces. In this case, the illusion of an enormous time span is what would be, if I presented this image in court, it would be objected to by an attorney as being non sequitur. That means it does not follow. The evidence which I'm trying to present of the myth of the time passage does not follow from what you are looking at here. It's a logical fallacy. Why is that? You see it? From the top of the Grand Canyon down to the Colorado River, let's call it the bottom, is a relief of 5,000 feet of erosion. Now, according to evolutionary geologists, right, they believe that this entire 5,000 feet of erosional relief in the canyon required only about 5 to 6 million years, depending who you're talking to. 5 to 6 million years you are looking at of erosional relief in their terminology, in their own words, okay? But yet they're trying to convince you that there's 20 million years or 10 million years along these surfaces where there is no evidence of any significant erosion. So you're looking at a logical fallacy with your own eyes, in that from here to here, 5,000 feet is considered to have occurred in 5 million years, but there is no feet, 0 feet of erosion over these vast periods of time. This image is in itself devastating to the idea of unconformities. Now, I know that I'm going to conclude here in about 5 or 10 minutes, but I know that you haven't dropped out of bed this morning thinking about unconformities, okay? Most of you, no doubt, are not geologists. You know, it's not something you normally think of. So I have made this illustration to try to enhance or complement what I've been talking about so far. Okay, we see here a illustration of a geologic column in which there is continuous deposition. Follow this logic by Dr. John Morris. Since field evidence indicates every formation was produced rapidly and catastrophically, we covered that in previous sessions, and since every such formation somewhere grades into another above it without interruption in the deposition process, see, there are no worldwide unconformities. If you are standing at this point and claim that there is a huge gap in time between these rocks and this surface, but as you walk it out, you may have to walk many, many miles or locate this surface, this contact at a different location. But as you walk it out, you eventually come to the point where you come to a continuous deposition, a conformable surface. Okay, so there are no real worldwide unconformities. Every unconformity that is claimed to be representing by millions of years of past time, you can walk out to a point where you will find that there is continuous deposition of the sediments right above it. Since the whole of the geologic column is the sum of its parts, the entire geologic column was formed continuously and rapidly in a worldwide interconnected complex catastrophe. Once you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains improbable must be the truth. Therefore, Captain, I conclude no significant elapsed time has occurred between the strata bounding the imagined paraconformable contacts or the structural unconformable contacts. You see, it was once believed, ladies and gentlemen, that the major unconformities were indeed worldwide, but this has been falsified by field evidence. As you walk them out, eventually you will come to a point where there will be rock layers above them that have been laid down by field evidence continuously right above them, without a unconformable time gap. Observation: all formations representing the entire geologic column show field evidence of having been deposited as a continuum without any time breaks at some place on the earth. I.e., every formation grades somewhere up into another formation continuously without a time break. In other words, you could follow that unconformity till you get to this somewhere, a place where it grades continuously into the formation above it without a time break. Worldwide compelling evidence demonstrates rapid deposition is universal throughout the sedimentary geologic column. Therefore, an unconformity contact cannot represent any particular deep time significance. Now, let me show you an animated illustration. I think you're getting the whole idea, but I tried to figure out how can I show you this. Let's take two persons, one at point A and one at point B. One person is standing at a place on the earth above an unconformity claim, right? They have a huge time gap between this surface and the surface above. The other person stands at point B. He is directly above the same surface, See, if you follow this down, he is directly above the same surface. However, at that point, we find a continuous gradation of conformable rocks right above that surface. Okay. Now let's start the time ticking here for both persons at point A and point B. The time duration at location A has to equal the time duration at location B. In other words, if we start time 0 right here, a certain amount of passage of time due to the continuous deposition of these sediments has to equal the same delta t, the same passage of time as this person over here. Because we can't cause time to disappear, right? Even Dr. Spock has told us that. Time cannot disappear at any place on the earth. So what do we have here? The period of erosion or non-deposition, which is claimed to have occurred right here in the unconformity, which we explained cannot possibly be on any place on the earth. The period of erosion or non-deposition cannot exceed this time interval right here. See, if you follow this rock layer over to here, and we see that at this point there's been continuous deposition, then this proposed interval, cannot exceed this time interval required to deposit these sediments. This is just mathematical logic. Therefore, no significant elapsed time has occurred between the strata bounding the unconformable contacts that's here. Deep time is an illusion of unbounded flights of imagination, because this time, if all these strata, as we have shown worldwide, shows universal rapid deposition, then this time interval, the maximum time interval represented here, is also a very short period of time, because they all represent, everywhere you go on the earth in the sedimentary rocks, a rapid deposition. The evidence indicates rapid deposition, not a long period of time. So the deep time is an illusion of unbounded flights of imagination. You know that in the movie Back to the Future, I'll end with this comment, that the DeLorean sports car was converted into a time machine, right? And you know out there that this time machine is an illusion, right? Then why do you believe that the illusion of evolution of billions of years? When we showed you that you would need a time machine in Bass Canyon to go between the alternating strata of Cambrian and Mississippian rocks, you would need a time machine to go back and forth to 200 million years. You know the time machine is an illusion, right? Therefore, the unconformities are also an illusion of deep time. Maybe next time we could talk about soft tissue, and perhaps we have time now for some questions and answers.
Oh, that was excellent, Sal. If I could I add another argument to support what you were saying? But I need Standing to share the screen for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just go through it, and I think you'll catch on pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah, there it is, George. Go ahead, brother.
Okay. The reason why I've shown that image there, as you probably know, it's lightning. What happens when lightning hits the ground? This is what happens. It forms a substance called a fulgurite, okay? I'm going to quote a Nature paper here. It says, when a cloud-to-ground lightning strikes an appropriate target material, such as sand, soil, rock, or clay, the current flows through the target, heating the material to temperatures that exceed its vaporization point, followed by rapid cooling that results in quenching to form a hollow cylinder of glass known as a fulgurite. So that's what a fulgurite is. Okay, you can see there, depending on the force of the lightning, it can actually travel a fair distance into the ground and through the rocks as well. Now, reading the Nature article, and you can find this in pretty much any publication you read about fulgurites, okay? They estimate that around 10 fulgurites form globally per second. That equates to 864,000 per day. Now, of course, this estimate depends on the efficiency of fulgurite formation by lightning, which is highest when it's striking barren sand, soil, or rock. Nevertheless, it's quite substantial. Now, my point is, if you follow the maths of that paper, we should be finding around 7,400 fulgurites per square meter. Now, they are very delicate and they do erode very, very easily. However, that number is quite substantial. And the point I want to make, based on what Sal was actually presenting, why don't we find any fulgurites in layers below the surface? If they've been there for millions of years, there would have been millions of strikes on that ground forming these fulgurites. But we don't find any. To my knowledge, they haven't found any fulgurites in layers below the surface layer. So that's what I just wanted to share with you, because I think it's important that we bring up that point.
Yeah, those are some great points, George. And once again, Sal, what a fantastic, irrefutable presentation. An hour flew by. We've had a great chat the entire time with a ton of great questions related to the topic. If you wanted to, we could go straight into the questions since we've got so many here. Looking to the side, George and I have saved them. And the first question that came in all the way at the beginning, Sal, from Landon Freeman. And his question is relating to the fossil record.
You can see it in the private chat, Sal, if you've got... Open up the private chat.
Were stromatolites pre-flood, or were most fossilized during and after the flood? I'm not sure if you see that one, Sal, right to the side.
Well, the stromatolites, let's see here. They do find evidence of stromatolites in Precambrian rock, which predates no doubt, a lot of the Precambrian rock predates the flood. And so the question is, say that a question again?
Yeah, no problem. Let me go back to it. Question from Landon Freeman. Were stromatolites pre-flood, or were most of them fossilized during and after the flood?
I believe that some of them were pre-flood, formed pre-flood. We do find them in Precambrian rocks, although we're not sure if all of those Precambrian rocks were actually pre-flood. There's some question about it, that some of the Precambrian may be also formed during the catastrophe of the worldwide flood. But we definitely find them down in what evolutionists believe are as old as, I think they're talking now about 3.5 billion, with a B, billion years old. And when we examine these living stromatolites today in various environments where we find them, we see no evidence of any evolution. In other words, the microorganisms, the algae, the blue-green algae, which form these stromatolite mats, are identical as far as we could tell as they are in the fossil record. And therefore, again, it is fairly conclusive evidence that there's been no so-called evolution for the so-called 3.5 billion years. So we do find stromatolites living today in various environments, usually in warm, shallow waters. We do find their rocks above the ground where they were fossilized occasionally, and in the so-called Precambrian rocks.
Well, great answer, Sal, and thank you for the question, Landon. Next question comes in here from Org in the chat. His question is, how would a wormhole survive the global flood? Wouldn't the force destroy something so delicate?
Well, a wormhole means that worm trackways are called, they're fossils that are indirect fossils, such as footprints, worm borings, and such. And what it shows is that those sediments had to be deposited quickly and then very quickly before they could be destroyed. These footprints and trackways and
Right.
Worm borings, such like that, they had to be not only deposited quickly, but they had to be very quickly also, with influx of a huge amount of sediments to preserve them. Otherwise, these trace fossils, as they're called, would, as we know, if they were sat on the surface of the earth very long at all, they would be eroded and disappear or destroyed.
Well,
again, it's just further evidence for rapid deposition to preserve them.
Right. I was thinking that exact same thing. Well, this question here then kind of relates to this. So I'll just go straight to this one. Would this same thing apply to some of these surface features, such as raindrop impressions, evaporite deposits, and meteor craters? Because the question is, are these types of surface features a problem for a worldwide flood? Raindrop impressions, evaporite deposits, and meteor craters, Sal.
Okay, well, the raindrop impressions come under the category of trace fossils. They're just like footprints, trackways, worm borings, and stuff like that. They're obviously delicate structures that, as again I said, in order to be preserved, they had to be very, very quickly before they would disappear and be destroyed. Now, evaporite deposits are a whole other story. Okay, so we have evaporite deposits worldwide, and some of these are enormously thick deposits, like salt domes and such. And we don't believe, creation geologists, that these deposits on the surface of the earth were formed by the evaporation of lake water, standing water, and then the salt precipitated out of the water over millions and millions of years, forming these deposits. We believe that they were formed rapidly by precipitation of the salt out of the saline waters of the worldwide flood.
Awesome answer, Sal, as always. George, I don't want to hog all these questions. Was there a specific question you had, brother, or even some comments you wanted to make?
We keep going back to this, the limestone and the sandstone layers. There's apparently a website called oldearth.org. They state, and I'm just quoting here, it says desert sandstones form right in the middle of Noah's flood, in brackets Coconino sandstone, Navajo sandstone, etc. Wind-blown sand cannot accumulate on a globe filled with water. What they're trying to say, Sal, is these sandstones actually are formed by wind-blown sand rather than water deposition. And we've gone through this many times with many people, and we've presented evidence about the angle of repose. I mean, there's even evidence in sandstone where we've had lime amongst the sandstone, and lime is deposited by water, not by wind. So, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just not to go over the same issues over and over again, but obviously many tests have been done by creationists and in flumes, and to show that these large sandstone cross-bedded deposits, which cover tens of thousands of square miles and are often on the order of several hundred feet thick, that they were formed by very rapid currents underwater and not by wind-blown sand on the surface of the earth. And there's evidence for this, not only in the angle of the cross-bedding, which is characteristic of being laid down in water, but also the trackways trying to, of various animals trying to move against the current water up the steep slope of the crossbeds, and apparently trying to escape the water as they were encroaching. And so there's a fair amount of evidence to indicate that these are not aeolian, that is windblown deposits.
Yeah, I'd like to share an image that also supports that argument. Standing, if you're there.
Oh yeah.
Just share this image, and I want to thank. I got this from Nephilim Free. You'll see there. That's the Coconino sandstone. You see those recumbent folds? Those folds. Sorry, people. Whoever asked that question. Recumbent folds don't occur in wind deposition. That is a water deposition. That is water deposition, and that sandstone's been moved laterally to form those bended layers, those bent layers.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I don't know of any sand dunes that have recumbent folds in them at all. Also, the origin of the sand in sand dunes themselves is enigmatic because in many cases, these enormous areas of sand dunes on the surface, they're actually on that we find on the surface of the earth today, not hardened rock, but actually sand dunes themselves. The origin of the sand is quite hard to explain from a natural evolutionary standpoint. All that sand did not come from the erosion of the surrounding mountains. That's been shown over and over again. Where that sand came from is very questionable from the standpoint of evolutionary ideas.
Yeah, in terms of the layers, I mean, the layers are homogeneous, so they have a problem explaining why so many layers are homogeneous and they're not mixed in with different materials. So that's another piece of evidence that suggests it was water deposition rather than wind.
Well, it's amazing just how overwhelming the evidence is for the Genesis flood, for a worldwide flood, and the best so-called arguments that the critics repeat over and over again, Sal, we consider them already debunked talking points instead of them tapping out. But it goes back to 2 Peter 3, of course, that they are willingly ignorant. And here's an argument and a question that the critics, Sal, on various websites such as BioLogos, or specifically pertaining to this argument here, oldearth.org, they state, Sal, that mud cracks are formed when surface mud dries and cracks. How could there be multiple dry periods during the middle of Noah's flood when all the world was supposed to be underwater? What's the best response and answer to that, Sal?
I have read what certain geologists had to say about that. Mud cracks can form, don't necessarily require a complete desiccation of the mud material, of the clay material, but they can form while the clay layer is still somewhat wet and under certain conditions. So it just doesn't, they don't always necessarily indicate that the surface had to dry out first.
Awesome. Thanks for that response, Sal. Let me see here. George, unless you had a couple comments, I can go to, I know there's another question from Org here. Did you want to get to that one, George?
Yeah, that's the one I was looking at.
All right, brother, go ahead.
Sal is a geophysicist. He says, how would a wormhole survive the global
George,
flood?
actually, George, we did that one. I was thinking about the other one. Why?
Sorry, I was out for a little while. For about 5 minutes, I had to answer a phone call, an important call for my mum.
No problem. It was it was this one. Why must the missing...
okay. Well, you can ask it.
Okay. So Org asks a question. Why must, I'm just going to read this word for word. So why must the missing U-rock be a stoppage of geoprocess? Just because it's missing does not mean there was nothing going on, only that we don't have evidence of what happened.
Well, I know this is a little hard concept to get through, because people, like I said, they don't fall out of bed thinking about unconformities. Okay. But the fact that the so-called intervening layers are missing, you have two choices. You could say they were never deposited in the first place, or you could say they were deposited and then completely eroded away. But in either case, you have to have on the surface of the earth one or the other. You can't have a place on the earth where there's no deposition and no erosion. So if they were not deposited, then that surface, it was eroding for that entire period of so-called gap, the time. And there should be even greater evidence on the surface of relief, erosional relief and evidence. If you say they were deposited and they were eroded off, then you should have evidence again at the contact of some sort of evidence of erosion. The process that eroded, say, 1,000 feet of sediments off the top, was going to produce some kind of evidence of erosion at the contact. So when you look at these contacts, especially the paraconformities, there's basically, not only is there no direct evidence of there ever having been any intervening layers deposited, I mean, that's just conjecture based on the idea of missing fossils, supposedly, or you have to say, okay, well, what type of evidence do we have of the erosion that had been going on for that period of time? And a flat surface simply doesn't stand up to any idea of erosion for millions of years on the surface of the earth. There's no place on the surface of the earth today that you could travel for thousands of square miles over a complete flat surface without seeing evidence of erosion somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well said. And we've got a super chat here that comes in from Nephilim Free. Thank you so much, brother. I appreciate the support. He makes a comment here, Sal. He says, since recumbent folds exist in the Coconino and Navajo, hundreds of kilometers or hundreds of miles of
Thousands.
sand, or hundreds of thousands of miles of sand were deposited very fast. This ruins evolution deep time. Well said. Any thoughts on that, Sal?
Sounds good to me.
We are in agreement.
I wouldn't expect recumbent folds in any kind of windblown deposit. I don't know. I don't know how you could possibly get that.
Or limestone in the layer, because we know limestone needs water to be transported and laid. So, Sal, while we're on the erosion issue, Godzilla Freak asks a question: what do the evolutionists even do to answer erosion? I think it means, how do they answer the erosion problem?
Oh,
yeah.
Well, I don't know that they have a real good rebuttal to it, because worldwide measurements have pretty much established how rapidly the continents are eroding, so I don't know how you can come up with a reasonable rebuttal to that, because the major objection they have is they say that there are areas of the continents that are rising, and that's why they're not eroded down to sea level. But as I pointed out in the previous session, that is not a satisfactory rebuttal whatsoever, because we know that there are areas of the continents that are rising, certain mountain chains and areas are rising. But if they are rising for millions of years, the sedimentary fossil-bearing deposits on them at the current rate of erosion would have long since been gone. And yet we have these sedimentary deposits still standing on top of mountains all over the earth. So that's an enigma based on current erosion rates. Those sedimentary deposits, which are just a veneer on the Earth's crust, should long since be completely eradicated. So their rebuttal of a rising mountains really doesn't make any real logical sense.
Yeah, Sal, in yesterday's stream, we covered the Himalayas, where some articles that we've read suggest that the Himalayas are rising at a rate of 5 to 10 millimeters per year. And when you read when they were formed, that varies quite considerably. Some articles say between 25 and 65 million years. Now, when you take into account the erosion rate, some papers that I've read, even with mountains, they suggest that mountains could erode within 33 million years. So if you take the 25 million years for the Himalayas to form and compare it to the 33 million years that they say the mountains will erode, we shouldn't have any Himalayas. But notwithstanding that, if you allow for the fact that they are rising at 5 millimeters per year, at 25 million years, the Himalayas should be over 100 kilometers high. And they're not. They're only 8 kilometers, 8.8 kilometers, I think it is. So it's all contradiction, that they just contradict each other with all, and it's their own empirical rates.
Exactly. These rates that have been measured, mountain rising and erosion rates, are worldwide measurements that are not necessarily been put together by creation geologists. I mean, this is a composite research done by many geologists and field representatives all over the earth have published numerous reports on these erosion rates. Yes, and the numbers don't add up. They simply don't add up on an evolutionary scale.
Oh, exactly. You got another one standing, or?
Yeah, well, I'm looking at these questions here now, Sal. I know in our previous 3 shows you've answered a lot of these, but since we do get new subscribers, new people watching, typically these same questions get asked again because, as you know, we're bombarded by the critics with kind of these same talking points over and over again. And one of the arguments here is, and George, I guess you kind of touched on it earlier, critics of young Earth creation have stated that limestones could not have formed within the short time frame, right? The 1 year of the flood. Sal, in your opinion, what is a good or even the best response to that assertion?
Well, the same argument is made for the chalk deposits, the diatoms and such. But actually, we have witnessed times on the Earth under certain chemical conditions where these minerals can be precipitated out very quickly. And like the chalk deposits, these diatom blooms, which are microscopic animals, you might say, microscopic organisms with silica tests, can also have blooms where they reproduce thousands of times faster under certain conditions of chemical composition of the water and temperature and such. So obviously in the past, during the flood, the waters of the flood that had ushered up from below the seabed, or maybe coming up from the deep crust of the earth, or possibly even the mantle, were obviously highly mineralized. And as we could see from all the wonderful crystals we get and minerals that have been deposited all over the earth. And these rocks were highly mineralized, and the limestone, which is basically calcium carbonate, has precipitated out along with some of these blooms of microorganisms.
Yeah, Sal, I'm sure you're aware of this, but it was one of the Scandinavian countries, I think it was Sweden. They're actually doing some research where they drilled a hole down into the lava regions, and they pumped CO2. Part of this climate change stuff, they were trying to see if they could actually remove the CO2 from the atmosphere and pump it into the ground. And to their surprise, Sal, when they did pump that CO2 into that lava, it actually turned to limestone. So it is a chemical process. You don't need micritic organisms to die to form limestone. There can be a chemical process, or it cannot.
Absolutely. We had during the worldwide flood voluminous discharges of hot subterranean water, which were probably saturated with various minerals, as well as sand and various minerals and all kinds of chemical processes, which we don't normally see on the earth today necessarily, was occurring.
And George, I guess as a possible rebuttal, your best buddy there, Org, A geophysicist in the chat says, as a response, curious to your thoughts, both Sal and George. So these blooms survived the flood. Then the flood happened to be at the right conditions to promote limestone formation, but only in certain parts of the world. What are your thoughts on this type of criticism?
Certain part of the world, is he kidding? The limestone layers that we find extend from England through to Central Europe, through the Middle East, through the North America, and even through to Australia. How can he say certain parts of the world? I mean, that's ridiculous.
Well, he's only a geophysicist, George. So.
Well, no, he may not understand that limestone and sandstone deposits are found all over the world, and many of these individual units extend even intercontinental. They can be traced between continents across the ocean as being part of the same units. This has been published many times in geologic literature. So limestone is ubiquitous all over the earth.
Well said. Great response. Oh, I'm sorry, George. Go ahead, brother.
I was going to ask, can I share the screen again? I want to show another example.
Of course.
Of how ridiculous the secular position is with regards to the erosion and fossilization process. But let me just, here we go. Now, those of you that aren't aware, I think I've brought this argument a few times, that they're the Hunstanton Cliffs in England. It's on the east coast of England. What you're seeing there, right? This is according to secular dates. The bottom layer was supposedly formed 109 million years ago, while the top layer is claimed to have formed 99 million years ago. That's a difference of 10 million years. So that little mathematics there, okay, that's 20 meters or 20,000 millimeters divided by 10 is a deposition rate of 0.002 millimeters per year. That brachiopod there was supposedly completely buried and fossilized at a rate of 0.002 millimeters per year. Come on, who are you trying to kid? This is ridiculous. Why don't they see the ridiculous nature of their position?
Well, George, they're willingly ignorant of the world that then was being overflowed with water perish. So,
Yeah.
Great questions from the audience so far. We got a couple more to get through. Sal, great responses, great visuals, and George, great job as well. So, this next question seems to have a built-in assumption in it, but the question is, and this actually is an argument and criticism that comes from, I believe it's Talk Origins, which is a website kind of infamous for criticizing the global flood. The question, Sal, is why is there no evidence of a flood in ice core series?
Well, the ice cores, the evolutionary community believes that there were like about 4 or 5 major ice ages in the earth, going back again, some of these for millions of years. The evidence for these so-called ice age sediments below the ground in the rock record going back so-called millions of years has been shown to be very tenuous, and that these deposits are not really glacial deposits at all, but are mega breccia flows below the water flows. Analysis of these, they're not really glacial tills and various deposits associated with glaciers. Now, the glaciers that we see on the surface of the earth that had formed, of course, were formed because of the worldwide flood, the conditions after the worldwide flood. So not during the flood, glaciers that had formed on the surface of the Earth, first in the mountain regions and then flowed out in the northern and southern polar areas, were post-flood phenomena, which has been explained in detail many times in creation research literature. And I must add, there is no satisfactory explanation anywhere in evolutionary research literature and published papers as to how the ice could have accumulated just simply by the cooling of the Earth. That is not possible. You have to have multiple factors which were associated with the flood.
Amen.
So there are the ice age is a surface phenomena on this, which occurred on the surface of the Earth after the flood.
Amen. Well said, Sal. Yeah, we had Michael J. Ord, who studied the Ice Age, the post-flood Ice Age, in great detail on a month ago for a presentation on the Ice Age, and we discussed how the global flood itself would provide the perfect necessary conditions for an Ice Age to begin with. While you're pointing out, it's the uniformitarians and those that believe in deep time evolution that have a problem with the Ice Age, and they invoke multiple Ice Ages, of course. So
none of the explanations, evolutionary explanations as to how the Ice Age could have occurred, are anywhere near satisfactory, because they cannot account for where the moisture at the poles, how the moisture at the poles accumulated there in such massive amounts simply by cooling of the Earth. That is not possible.
One of the things I read the other day, Sal, was an article from ICR, and what they've done, they expanded on Dr. Vardaman's Ice Age theory, and they've actually now successfully carried out computer modeling to show how the Ice Age was possible via what he proposed. So if anyone's interested, go to ICR and search for that article. I forget the name of it, but yeah, they've done computer modeling simulations to show that it can happen. And Sal, we'd love to do another one on soft tissues. That's a beautiful subject.
Awesome subject. Yeah, maybe we can make that one the next one, or I mean, it's up to you, Sal. I know you've got a number of fascinating presentations, and you've kept everyone's attention. We've still got 40 people in the chat. We are coming up at 2 hours, so I want to respect your time, Sal. Why don't we end with this question? We got a couple questions, but I will direct people to our previous show with you, Sal. For example, there's a question here on the fossil record and the sorting of it. Why don't we find dinosaurs and humans together? Sal, you and I discussed that actually in great detail on the last show. But this specific question, I'm not sure if we've really gone into detail on in terms of the Q&A portion. But the question is, Sal, how does a global flood explain angular unconformities?
Well, I think only a global flood can explain angular unconformities. As I've shown in some of the illustrations, when you have sediments that have been deposited horizontally and then tectonically reshifted their position to where they're now at an angle to the Earth's surface, which is semi-common around the Earth. We have massive deposits of strata sitting up at the surface where we can observe it at various angles up to 90 degrees, okay? But let's take a deposit at 45 degrees. Within those various sediments, you're going to have different induration of the various sediments. In other words, the sandstone, the shales, the limestone have different properties. There are different hardness, different, they undergo chemical weathering differently. And so if these rock strata, which are angularly, you could see it at the surface, they were observed at the surface, if they were eroding for countless ages of time, they would erode in a regular manner. In other words, the harder ones would be sticking up further and the softer ones would be eroded further down. And we would have a very irregular surface depending on the degree of induration of the various sedimentary layers. Does that make sense?
Yes.
But in a sense, what we see in many cases, the angular unconformities are flat, as if someone took a plane and just planed it right off. And we do not see this irregularities between the different sedimentary strata as we would expect. And something has to account for that. And it can only reasonably be accounted by a very high energy flow of water running across these angular protruding sediments and just planing them off in a manner and what we call forming planar surfaces. And it's very difficult to explain those surfaces, which extend for thousands of square miles in some cases, on the basis of a slow erosion process at the surface.
Thanks, Sal. That's great answer. There's another question that's just come in. We might call it a wrap up after this one, but it says, how do you explain fossil mineralization? Mineralization is the replacement of the original material with a different mineral. The original material with a different mineral.
Well, when the fossils were buried rapidly, excuse me, just let me get this sunlight out of my eyes here.
Okay.
Okay, when the fossils were buried rapidly, the organic material is often replaced, sometimes even on a cellular level, by the minerals. And that's why we get petrified, so to speak, and fossils. The minerals actually replace the organic material, in some cases on a one-to-one basis, cellular basis, where we could actually see under a microscope what the original fossil looked like in the case of petrified wood and organic material. So it's a chemical replacement of the organic material with inorganic chemicals.
And if they believe in the deep time scenario, they should be fully permineralized, but they're not. We find that they're not fully permineralized, which means that's why we find soft tissue. We can carbon date them, and so many other things. So it works against them rather than for them. Every fossil should be fully permineralized if it was millions of years old.
You would think so.
Yeah.
Well said. Well said. Well, we are going on the 2-hour mark, Sal. I got to say, time always flies by with you. So far, every single show we've done with you has been either 2 hours or more, with a ton of great questions. You always give great answers, Sal. Nothing stumps you, I find, and you are an encyclopedia of information. So God bless you for that, and thank you so much for helping us out, Sal, and being such a blessing to this ministry. Did you have any final words before we shut it down, Sal?
Sure. What I tried to explain is something in unconformities that people are not usually familiar with. So I've tried to show coming from different directions as to why these unconformities of the great passage of time are basically an illusion. So I tried to show you why that is, and logically why it is not reasonable to assume that they represent millions of years of Earth history. They're just simply a place to extend the deep time of the geologic column, because the sedimentary rocks that we do observe today are known universally to have been laid down very rapidly everywhere we look. And therefore, the evolutionists have to insert millions of years of Earth history somewhere. And the convenience story is in these unconformities.
Amen. Well said, Sal. This is the kind of presentation that I am definitely going to rewatch, because there's just so much good information throughout it that you almost got to watch it 2 or 3 times just to catch it all. So thanks again, Sal. Thanks for giving us your time. George, any final words, my amazing award-winning co-host?
Yes. As you know, Sal, on this channel, we're about defending the truth of biblical creation. And we always finish off by saying, I'm going to trigger some evolutionists now. Evolution is nothing more than presuppositions supported by vivid imagination, unproven and unverifiable assumptions, biased and subjective interpretations, outlandish speculation and conjecture grounded in untestable hypotheses, which makes evolution no more than just so stories. Sorry, I have to bust your bubble, okay? That's the truth. You've got no empirical science behind it. And as I always finish off by saying, may the Spirit of God open your eyes to the light, your ears to the truth, and your heart to his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ.
Amen, brother.
Amen.
Amen. Well,
Amen. That is the ultimate purpose of these sessions.
Amen. Amen. And these sessions, Sal, have been a blessing to so many. So God bless you for that. God bless you as well, George. And thank you to the audience. Thanks for tuning in and sticking with us for the whole 2 hours and giving us so many awesome questions. So God bless everybody. Standing for Truth is out.